Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Planet Zoo. Today's episode is a little bit of a filler episode, but it's also very important. We are going to be building a habitat for the Dall sheep today in our mountain biome, and that will kind of come a little bit later on. But today, to begin, I want to kind of lay out a roadmap for how we're going to finish this zoo. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, the game's starting to feel quite sluggish. It's affecting the tour segments, it's affecting the building, and it's making everything slow down quite a bit. I don't want to adjust my graphics, I don't want to do anything to try and make things quicker or speed this up. It's time to kind of have a target for finishing this one. So the things that we need to do, we need to finish off our campsite area to the right of your screen there. We also need to do the North American wetlands section. Next to that, we're going to have an African 4x4 safari, which just has herbivores that can all live in the same area. There's then going to be a huge forest enveloping the entire old town with a nice river running through it, and that will all start from a nice waterfall on the extension of our mountain biome, which is then going to allow us to feature some colder climate animals as we get higher up. So let's dive in and I'll continue talking as we develop our new sections. So we're going to start with our mountain, and this is basically going to be extended all the way around to this little corner of the map. And you can probably already tell by now that the game is a little bit sluggish, and there's a lot of things that I've tried to do to rectify this, but none of them satisfy me in a way. I really like to keep things of a high quality, and when things are starting to get affected like this, it does kill my inspiration and my desire to build a little bit. You can see here, I'm even trying to adjust the graphics a little bit to bring them down, but it makes it difficult for me to build and see what I'm doing. I really like to see my details unfold. The good news is, because things are running a little bit slower, I'm getting these really nice slopes being created when I expand my mountain area. And this is basically going to have a nice cave on top of it, which we're not going to put in today, but when we come round to finally add in some animals here, there's going to be a cave that has a lot of water inside of it, as if it's some sort of glacial cave that is affected by seasonal change, which continues to have the lake at the top filled with water. And that is then going to roll down across the landscape and through this lush European forest that we're going to put in a little bit later on, which is really exciting, and kind of visualizing it and building it in this manner is really helping me quite a bit. So we're continuing with our terrain stamps, and I just mark these out to make a large area and then use the flatten to foundation tool to match it all up and get that entire middle part filled in. This is just the way that I build. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of you will have your own way of making mountains and working with the terrain tools, but this has just always been the best for me. And what I like to do is I had to put a big stamp down and just get a basic structure of my terrain in place before putting in the details when we come to do like some sort of habitat build. So I'll start using the terrain tools in a little bit more depth and detail when it actually comes to developing this area. Today is just about mapping this all out. So you can see we're coming back in with our terrain stamp and trying to create some nice natural height in this area. Again, the flatten the foundation tool always helps. It gives us the ability to fill in any gaps and blanks and just keep everything moving nice and smoothly. And it's starting to build up quite nicely. So we'll continue doing this, and then eventually there'll be a bit of a higher peak on this mountain. Now, they're not exactly mountains, they don't go very high, but we will like to try and get them a little bit higher as we come round to actually developing this area. And I do need to be careful because things are starting to move a lot slower, so I don't want the performance to be impacted too much, like I've already said. Now, the next thing is to make a little forest brush here, and we're just using a selection of all of the larger trees from the European temperate zone. We're going to then make these into a group and then start slapping them down, and you'll see our finances dwindle pretty quickly, which is why we finish this entire segment pretty quickly. But once these are all stamped in, you can see I'm leaving a bit of a gap here, and what we're going to do with that gap is put a nice stream or river flowing into various areas where we're going to have water start to pool up and form little lakes. Eventually, if my system allows it, I might build something here, like a boat tour of some description. I always wanted one in Old Town, but we've never been able to make that work, so I'm just going to leave it. If at the end, before we actually finish and close off Arcadia and leave it for pastures new, If the system hasn't exploded, I will make a nice little boat tour with some small habitats in for our lake-dwelling residents in this area. But for now, this is simply scenery. It's not going to have anything added to it. So we're putting this in now just so I can kind of get an idea of where the map is. And I see there that this little stream section that comes out looks a little bit too uniform. So we put that in, get it sorted, and then come in with our final finishing touches of our tree brushes there. Then we're going to go over here, and we want to try and mark out an area here where our North American wetlands area is going to finish. And then this little grove here is actually going to have some African grazing animals in there. Now, it might be African grasslands, or it might be, I don't know, some other sort of African-based animal that has like a desert area or something. But we're going to do a nice 4x4 tour in there. And now we're going to move on to our Dall sheep habitat. So we're already putting in some of the rock work here, and there is a lot of it in this build. It's mainly because of the fact that the Dall sheep like to jump, and they will escape this habitat with relative ease. Now, that makes our job a little bit difficult to make things look natural and not too man-made in this little area here. I don't want to do too much in the way of fencing or backstage area. I'd quite like this to have like the gate here built right into the side of this little cave that we're building, and this is basically the only hard shelter that the Dall sheep are going to have. I'd quite like it to be a nice open space. We've got a lot of room here, over 2,500 square meters of space for our animals, and that means we could actually bring in the Alpine Ibex to share this habitat, and I might try that towards the end of this build, or maybe just in time for the tour, just so I can make sure that all of the foliage and stuff matches both of those, given that the Alpine Ibex is a more European animal and the Dall sheep is North America. So we need to make sure that the foliage is correct for both of those species and the coverage is also correct for them. So I'm doing a little bit of terrain shaping here just to get this a little bit better. It's a little bit of an unorthodox area in terms of the landscape, so this is quite difficult as well. I'm going to come in now and put in soil everywhere, and that's just going to help me realize where the barriers are. We do have to do some adjustments to the barriers as well to make sure that everything's correct, but for now we're just putting in some rocks to highlight where those barriers end, and then we can carry on with our rock work. Now here, I'd quite like this to be open. There's not going to be any railings on this little bit of pathway that goes over here, so that the guests can just look down into the habitat. And there's not a great deal of viewing area here as well. I have made a little fence, which you'll see later on. It does take up a couple of spaces in the other facing side of the path here as we come around this little corner, but overall there's not a great deal of viewing space at the moment. We will probably make some adjustments once we flesh out this area a little bit more, but for now we're just focusing on the habitat that is immediately in front of us. So you can see there's still lots of rock work going in, and actually I didn't go too detailed with this like I usually do. So because we've got quite steep drops with the rocks, it was about making sure there weren't too many ledges that the Dall sheep could climb up, because if they can get on one, they will then use that as a step to get onto another level and another, and eventually escape the habitat. And like I said, we are only working on the habitat itself, so a lot of the background areas won't be finished, and that'll come later on. Like I've already said in this video, a lot of the finishing touches are going to be done in separate episodes. I just want to make sure that we're moving ahead at pace with finishing off our habitats. So you're going to see a lot of areas that seem to have unfinished backdrops and things, and that's something that I will eventually work on as we move through the new areas at a quicker pace. I'd like to get these episodes moving very, very quickly. Now we're going to build our barrier, and you can see here I'm using like a 2 meter high wall piece here to give me a bit of a guideline for how I'm going to build it. And then again, I wanted to use New World pieces, so this gets a little bit fiddly. I really like some of the copper shades and things that come with the New World pack, and I've not used them yet, so this was the perfect time to do so. I tried using this little aluminium piece, but that didn't really work, and then the overlaps on the actual copper pieces weren't going very well either. I always like to use this little piece here. I think it's fantastic, so using that to create our barrier was a really nice idea. I basically just put this in, and then when I realized it wasn't actually going to work, I decided to just duplicate 3 of them, and then this would then form up the length of our new fence. Using these copper shades as toppers for this, I then put in the, I think this is the copper sunshade post here, and then we put the actual base on the top, and that would then allow us to put some lights and stuff just on the very top of these barriers, which means we can bring in a little bit of a nighttime viewing for our guests. Ran a nice little wooden pane across the top, and then put in some mesh so that we have a nice custom fence that's completed. I did have to duplicate the mesh a little bit and get it matched up so that it went all the way across. That's due to the fact that this has a little bit of a strange length in comparison to the usual 4-meter lengths that we actually like to play around with when I'm building fences. But that was in position, and then it was just about matching it up and bringing it around here. Now, I did run into a few issues here, as you will no doubt see, with getting these actually flush and pulled together. This was because we have like really quite stark pillars for the sides of these with those copper shades. It's where they kind of work against you. Now what I could do is just kind of use one of those. I do try it here, and it doesn't work again because we then have that signage that forms up the middle layer of the fence, and that doesn't work for us. So even after I put in this rock here, I have to end up taking it all out and kind of making a few adjustments, and that was done by using the wooden beam that we have running across the top here. And what I did was I flipped it over and made a little bit of a wood wall that would go in between these fences here, and that just allows me to match up the next block of fencing. And what we'll then do is we'll probably put some TV screens on there, educational boards, or a couple of other signs. It just gives us a nice flat background to work with for that little piece there. I did try, as you can see, using some different things, but nothing really worked. And when I eventually put this in, I then had the idea to use those single wooden beams to create a nice little divide between those viewing spaces. And that just happens now, basically. You can see us pulling it across and then dropping it down, and that would basically become the divider between these viewing areas. And you can see now I've started leaving little bits and little gaps in between things, so that ended up kind of, it gives you a nice little bit of light coming through, but also stops clipping between the boards. And it just got duplicated and moved across, and then we continued that on until our fence was complete. So I've covered everything in rock, and that's basically going to allow me to devise my own little scenes within this habitat. And you can see we're coming in with white sagebush in. We've also got some pine trees in there as well, just to start giving us a little bit of coverage in terms of forestry and foliage. Now, the one thing we do need to be aware of is you can see the coverage there. It's not amazing. They don't deal with a lot of foliage here, the Dall Sheep, so it's got to be quite, that's why we're leaning quite hard into the rocks and stuff and making sure that we've got lots of little bits and pieces there. And we'll also have to make use of our terrain brushes to add a little bit more texture and depth to the habitat. Thankfully, using some of the smaller bushes and like grass work here and flowers, we've been able to get quite a nice bit of coverage, but it's not quite enough, and I've skipped ahead eventually so that I can put all of this in off camera. But for now, I'm going to show you some of the little bits and pieces that I am doing to really boost the vibrancy of this build. Eventually, of course, the terrain brush will come in, and we'll not have this all as like a big swatch of rock work, but I do want to put in a few scenes using construction pieces, due to the fact that we don't have a lot of space that we can fill with foliage. Of course, I could use the same trick I used with the Somali Wild Ass of using those little the wood panels with the grass and the foliage attached to them, so that's an option that we can definitely exploit later on in the build. But here we are coming in with our terrain brush just to really finish off this area, bringing in some nice grass coverage that merges pretty seamlessly with the rocks and gives you a nice little bit of a merge down into the next part of the build. Of course, the white sage now has to come in just to highlight a little bit of these rocks and have some stuff growing through, just to add a little bit more depth to it all. We used the crowberry bushes and some manzanita bushes and a few others that just really give a nice bit of texture to the entire build, which is really nice. It's starting to come together quite nicely, which is really good to see. This was a very quick build, and it's not completely finished yet, but we will have it all wrapped up before the tour actually starts. So what I did want to do was create something that would be a little bit of a highlight piece, kind of a statement piece for this. And because we're coming into a mountainous area, what I wanted to do was use the stock watchtower, but give it some sort of ruined structure that would feed into it. So I used the basic wooden logs to create what would eventually be a walkway or a bridge that had collapsed. And I use the Australia wood planks here because I really like the jagged edges to it. They are exactly what I'm looking for this build. So this comes in and we just first of all start putting in a basic flat panelled structure here. We then moved out our supporting beams to give it a nice flat platform, and then we needed some metal bracing that's basically holding all of that wood in place. That then comes across and we just fill in the blanks here before finishing it all off, just making some light adjustments here with the panels to try and get them as flush as possible with those wooden beams that are actually going to be holding the whole structure up. This then cuts into the mountainside there, and I did have a little bit of trouble lining it all up and getting the heights and the measurements correct. But once that was in place, I could then duplicate this and add in a few more supporting beams to really finish it all off. It then comes out over the mountain area here, going into what would probably be something at some point, or has been, but I'm basically going with the idea that we actually put this in as a decorative touch rather than it being a ruin that we have built a habitat around, because this has nowhere else to go really. I could have done like a little bit of a train track here so it looked like a collapsed minecart once went through this area, but I thought I'd just leave it as a bit of a mountain overlook of some description that has collapsed. So some of these wooden beams are then going to be adjusted so that they're basically falling in and hanging on by a thread, I guess. I'm not too keen on that longer piece, but for now we'll leave that as it is. It's not looking too bad, and especially once we finish it all off and add in a few more bits of wood that have kind of collapsed, it starts to look a little bit more fleshed out. Now, the one thing that I might do is put in another metal brace that runs right through the middle of that area there, just so that those wooden panels that are in between have some sort of support keeping them in place. But we then add in a little bit of plank work down here, and then I wanted to make sure that I had the second piece in here where it used to attach to, that has now completely collapsed, and those wooden supporting beams just go down onto the bottom there so that it looks like these were once there. I did try to use a bit of rope to look like it kind of was all held together with something, but the Planet Zoo logs are a little bit too thick for the rope to stick out on either end. And we then added a few more crates and a wheelbarrow just sticking out of the ground there. Like this is all kind of all fallen in on itself, and the nature has reclaimed that area that was once used. We put some basic supporting struts right across the middle there, just to keep everything well structured and make it look like it's got some sort of support. And yeah, it's all coming together very nicely. So we're going to jump ahead to the tour now, because this has been like a bit of a double episode where we've done a few different things. But I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see if we get those Alpine Ibex in as well. I'm going to do a bit more foliage to finish it all off, because it still looks a little bit bare. But the last thing to do was to put in that watchtower right at the top there, so that it looks like we've got something to feed down onto that platform. I hope you enjoyed the tour. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.